Today I want to share with you how to make a bread that's so easy anyone can make this. It only requires 4 simple ingredients. You let it rise on your schedule, not the bread schedule, and once you're ready to bake it, you just pop it into the oven. If you have a Dutch oven, great. If not, don't worry about it. It can be baked on a baking sheet, and before you know it, you're gonna have some of the best artisan bread you've ever had. Hi, sweet friends. If we're meeting for the first time, I'm Mary from marysnest.com and author of the Modern Pioneer Cookbook, and I'd like to welcome you to my kitchen. This is a full-length baking tutorial, so if at any time you want to jump ahead, be sure to check the timestamps in the description below. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you're just going to need 4 ingredients to make this bread. The first is going to be flour. You can use all-purpose flour or you can use bread flour. Either one will work just fine, and you're going to need 3 cups. Next, you're going to need some yeast, just plain old packaged yeast from your local grocery store. And the type of yeast you need, again, very flexible. If you've got active yeast, that'll work just fine. If you've got instant yeast, that'll work too. They're really not that different. The only difference that probably is the most common thing to notice when you're reading the package is that active yeast generally likes water that's around 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and instant yeast is a little more forgiving and can tolerate up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. But you know what? In this recipe, it doesn't matter, because the bottom line is, if you want to use cold water for this recipe, you can. If you want to use lukewarm water for this recipe, you can. And if you want to use water that is up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit and you're using instant yeast, you can use that too. And what exactly does 130 degree Fahrenheit feel like? It's kind of like bath water. But again, it doesn't matter. And the chances of you using boiling water is very unlikely. And that's something you do want to avoid, because boiling water does have the potential to kill your yeast. However, the likelihood of getting boiling water out of your kitchen sink faucet is very unlikely. But know that if you're worried about this in one way or the other, just use cold water. Now, how much yeast you're going to use will depend on how long you want to leave your dough to rise. That's what I meant earlier by this being on your schedule, not the dough or the bread schedule. Now, for this bread recipe, we're going to be using somewhere between a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast or a 1/2 teaspoon of yeast. And how much we use is going to be based on how quickly we want to be able to bake our bread. If you want to mix this dough in the morning and bake it for dinner that same day, you're probably going to want to use a 1/2 teaspoon of yeast. The same would be true if you want to mix your dough at night and bake your bread in the morning. You'll want to use a 1/2 teaspoon of yeast. If, on the other hand, you want to let your dough just sit longer than a day's worth of time, say approximately 8 hours, you then only need to use a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. And now, why would you want your dough to sit longer, and why would you just want to use a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast? Let's talk about that. The less yeast you use and the longer you allow your dough to rise and, in essence, ferment like a sourdough, the tastier your dough is going to be and the more holes it's going to have. The other wonderful thing about just using a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast is that you have a lot of time leeway as to when you need to bake your bread. So if you say to yourself, I don't think I can bake this until maybe 18 hours from now, a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast is going to serve you perfectly. Now, what we've talked about so far is just focusing on leaving our dough, as you see I've got some over there, leaving our dough on our counter to basically rise and, in essence, ferment. What if you would just like to have some dough in your fridge and you're really not going to be ready to bake it for maybe 24 hours or even 48 hours? what should you do? If you want to bake your dough 24 hours after making it, use a half a teaspoon of yeast and then cover your bowl and stick it into your refrigerator. This will create a nice slow rise and you'll be ready to bake your bread after 24 hours. What if you want to stretch that time out even longer and bake your bread in 48 hours? You can do that too. All you're going to want to do is pull back the amount of yeast you use a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, mix up your dough, and then put it in your refrigerator, and you can bake your bread 48 hours later. Now, I loosely use the word ferment when I'm talking about this. What we're talking about is letting the dough rise. But because we're using small amounts of yeast and we're letting the dough rise for a long period of time, I often think of this as a little bit of a mock sourdough or a little cheat, but I'm okay with that because if you have struggled with sourdough, getting your sourdough starter going, making sourdough bread, which I definitely can help you with that, but if you struggle with these things, and if sometimes you just want to use packaged yeast from the grocery store, then this is a good option for you, because this is going to create a bread very similar to those sourdough boules, as they are called, those rounds that you see at the bakeries. We're going to create a beautiful artisan loaf of bread by extending the rise time and using a little bit of yeast. Now, is it sourdough, official sourdough? No, it's more like a mock sourdough. But you know what? It's going to be delicious. Alrighty, well, we've talked a lot about yeast. What are the other 2 ingredients? Very easy, and I'm confident you've got these in your kitchen. One is salt, and you can use any kind of salt you have. And this is just a fine ground sea salt. Use whatever type of salt you have, but just use a fine ground option. Now, what if you say, oh, Mary, I'm on a low salt diet. I really don't want to put salt in the bread. Can I leave the salt out? Good news. Yes. You can be like a Tuscan in Italy. In Tuscany, they leave the salt out of their bread, so you can too. Now, there's a historical reason regarding a tax on salt as to why they left salt out of their bread, but you can leave salt out of your bread. It will have a slightly different, almost a little more blander flavor, because salt always improves flavor for most of us in our palates. But if you want to leave it out, the good news is you can. So since you can leave salt out, you can also manage how much salt you want to add to this bread. You can use a half a teaspoon, you can use a teaspoon, you can use a teaspoon and a half, you can even use up to 2 teaspoons. I have found, just my personal preference, is that about a teaspoon and a half of fine ground salt, specifically a fine ground sea salt, works very well. Our final ingredient is just some water. Now, how much water are you going to need? A lot is going to depend on the conditions in your kitchen as well as the conditions of the weather where you live. Most of the time you're going to want to start with about 1.5 cups of water and then work up from there. I live in a hot, dry climate and I usually need 2 cups of water. So that'll give you a good gauge as to how much water you may need. But we're going to start with 1.5 cups so I can show you what the texture looks like, and then I'm going to probably have to go up to 2 cups, and then you will see exactly how you want your dough to look, either using that 1.5 cups, using 1 3/4 cups, or even going up to 2 cups. It's all about the consistency of your dough and not the exact amount of water. Now, I'm going to use bread flour, and the reason is bread flour, as the name implies, works very well for making bread. And the reason is it has a little more protein than all-purpose flour, and protein helps give a nice structure to your bread. But if you've got all-purpose flour, it's going to work, so don't worry about it. Now, the good news is you don't have to weigh anything. Just take your basic dry measuring cup and scoop some flour out of your bag, and then just level it off with your knife, just like that. I'm going to do it right into this bag. I normally have this flour just in here, but I had the package so you could exactly see what type of flour I was using. And yes, I live in Texas. I shop at H-E-B. Then you're going to need a bowl. Any bowl. I'm using a glass bowl so you can see what I'm doing, but if you have a ceramic bowl, if you have a stainless steel bowl, whatever you have is fine. This recipe is very forgiving, so it's really not a big deal when you're measuring this flour. Don't feel that you have to get very exact. It's going to be fine because everything's dependent on the water and finding the right texture, which I'm going to show you. And you never have to worry. Another thing that's wonderful about this recipe is, say you add a little too much water and then you have a little bit of a gloopy mess, you just add more flour. So it's great. It's just so easy to work with. That's why I say anyone can make this. You can't go wrong. So I've got my 2nd cup of flour in my bowl. Now I'm going to go ahead and put in my 3rd cup. Now there is one thing I want to mention because I do get a lot of questions about this. I'm showing you here that I'm using organic flour. And for those of you who are familiar with H-E-B, you know that they're on a mission to provide a lot of organic products at a reasonable price for their consumers, for their shoppers. And this is not sponsored by H-E-B. I just shop at this grocery store and I really like it. But that is kind of their mission. So they make these things affordable and organic. But if you don't have the availability of an organic flour, don't worry. As I said, very forgiving recipe. It really doesn't matter. Use whatever bread flour or whatever all-purpose flour you have. Now, that kind of begs the question, can you use an all-purpose spelt flour or an all-purpose einkorn flour? And those are your ancient grains, and when I use the term all-purpose, it means they're not the whole grain version of those flours. They've had the bran and the germ sifted out of them. I've made videos where I've showed you how to grind einkorn, sift out the bran and the germ, and then have an all-purpose einkorn flour. And yes, you can make this bread with all-purpose einkorn flour, or you can make this with all-purpose spelt flour. Now, I've showed you how to make these things in a homemade way. If you buy them in an all-purpose form, you can certainly use those too. And what is so great about this particular recipe and using those ancient grain flours in their all-purpose form is that they absorb water differently than modern wheats. These flours have had the bran and the germ sifted out of them, but they were ground originally from modern-day whole wheat flours. But einkorn flour and spelt flour, and emmer, if that's sort of the one that's right in the middle, some people know it as farro. If you're using any of those ancient grain flours, they absorb water differently. But that's the beauty of this recipe, because you're going to be adding water little by little until you get the desired texture. And if you are using one of those ancient grain flours, you're going to wind up using less water. Now I'm just going to use a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, and I'm just going to go ahead and sprinkle that right on top of my flour. And now I'm going to go ahead and add my 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Now, let's dispel this, what should I say, rumor? I don't know what the right word is, about salt and yeast. You do not have to just put the yeast in with the flour and the water and then later at some point massage in the salt. That is not necessary at all, and it seems awfully cumbersome to me. In order to kill your yeast, you would need a lot of salt. This little bit of salt that's mixed in with the flour won't kill your yeast, but you don't have to take my word for it. All the big baking sites like King Arthur Flour and Breadtopia, they'll all tell you the same thing. So if you wanted to go look over, say for example, kingarthurflour.com and just search, does salt kill yeast? And they will explain to you how a little bit of salt mixed in with your flour is not going to kill your yeast. But the good news is that this little bit of salt with our yeast in our flour does slightly slow down the fermentation process or the rise process. And that's a good thing. It's not going to completely stop it and kill your yeast. No, not at all. It might slow it down a little bit, and that's a good thing when you're making these artisan breads that you're allowing to give a good rise time to. Anywhere from 8 hours to 12 hours to 18 hours to 24 hours to 48 hours, as we discussed earlier. And what you will find with the rises that you do on your counter as opposed to in your refrigerator is that a lot will depend. I use the time frames relatively loosely because is your kitchen 65 degrees Fahrenheit or is it 80 degrees Fahrenheit? So if you're rising the dough on your counter and you make it in the morning and it's really hot in your kitchen and then you're going to be heating it up even more when you preheat the oven, which we'll talk about in a minute, then you want to figure on no more than 8 hours. If your kitchen is really, really cold, it may take a little longer with even a half teaspoon of yeast in your flour. So it's really, but you know what the bottom line is? It's not going to be significant. So if you make your dough at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning and you want to bake it sometime in the afternoon, even if your kitchen is cool, you're going to find that it has had a nice rise with a half teaspoon of yeast. I just want you to keep in mind, it's not an exact science. There's a lot of wiggle room with these slow risen breads. So even if you say, oh no, I'm in a rush, I didn't allow enough time, it's only been 5 hours, chances are it's going to come out okay. Will it be maybe will it have risen as high as maybe one that's been allowed to go 8 hours or one with a quarter teaspoon that maybe has gone 16 hours? Maybe not, but the bottom line is no one's going to really notice. All they're going to know is you baked them bread and your house is going to smell amazing. Alrighty, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a whisk and I'm just going to incorporate the yeast and the salt into the flour. Couldn't be easier. Just as a side note, in case you're interested in the type of yeast that I like to use, it's simply the SAF Instant Premium Yeast. You can probably find this at your grocery store. If not, I'll be sure to put a link in the description below. But again, as I said earlier, pretty much any yeast can do. Well, we'll start with about 1.5 cups of water. I've just made a little well in the flour, no big deal. And then I'm just going to go ahead and start pouring my water in. Well, I've poured in 1.5 cups of water into my dough or into my flour. And now I'm just going to take a little spatula. They call this like a spoonless spatula, but a wooden spoon will work just fine too. And I'm just going to start mixing the water into the flour, and the point of this in terms of getting the right consistency is we want to make sure that all of the flour is completely moistened with the water and that we have what's often referred to as like a shaggy consistency, even almost a little past a shaggy consistency. We want a relatively well hydrated, malleable looking dough. Now you'll see with 1.5 cups in the climate I'm in and in my kitchen, this is quite dry. This is not what you're looking for. So you're going to want to continue. If yours now has mixed up and looks like what my final product will look like, which I'll show you in a minute, you're all set. But if yours is looking dry like mine, we're going to go ahead and add in more water. Now, you could go 1/4 cup at a time and keep mixing. But I know, just kind of based on my kitchen and experience, I'm going to need the final 1/2 cup because I generally need, at this time of year, I'm making this really when it's very hot here. I'm filming this in August, and August, September, even pretty much to October. It's pretty warm here, so I generally need the full 2 cups. So I'm going to go ahead and just add in my remaining 1/2 cup, of water, and I'm just going to start mixing this until I get all of that water incorporated and all of my dough nicely saturated, and then I'll show you what you're going to be looking for in terms of consistency. So just a few spins around with your spatula or your wooden spoon will incorporate the water, and then the texture that you're looking for is this very, very shaggy, very well hydrated dough. It's like almost like gloopy, but that is exactly what you're looking for, because all of this hydration is what is really going to help this dough do a nice job and turn into a beautiful artisan bread. So that's what you're looking for. So just add enough water until you get to this consistency. Now, as I said earlier, if you find that you've gone past this type of consistency, just sprinkle in some flour. You'll be fine. Now all you have to do is cover your bowl. You can use plastic wrap, a dish towel, whatever you have. I'm lucky that this particular bowl comes with a lid. And that's it. And now I'm going to put this on my counter. I'm just going to leave it there. And this can sit there for, since we used 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, this can sit on my counter for 16 hours. Or if I want to tuck this into the fridge and bake this 48 hours later, I might do that also, especially since I've got 2 over there on my back counter. That might actually work well. But again, depending on the temperature in your kitchen, just eyeball it. You know, everybody says, you know, when it looks about double in bulk, that's fine. That's, just eyeball it. Don't worry that, oh, is it double? Is it not double? If it's bubbly on top and there are some little lumps and bumps and little holes that have been caused by bubbles, it's ready to bake. And I'm going to show you that in the ones that I have over on my back counter. Now this bowl was made with 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, and I made this one before I made this one, which I made with 1/2 teaspoon of yeast. This has probably gone a good 15 to 16 hours, and this has probably gone somewhere in the 12-hour mark. And so I want to show you this one and see how it's looking so that you will know what you're looking for as well. Now, when I checked this at 8 hours, it looked pretty good back then too, but with the magic of television, so to speak, and having to wait until I could actually film this and show it to you, I did need to go a little longer, but that's okay, because again, this is all very forgiving. So if you make this in the morning and you want to bake it for dinner, great. If you bake this at night and you want to bake it at breakfast time, and there has been a 12-hour span and you've used 1/2 teaspoon of yeast, you're going to be fine. Now here is what the dough looks like after about 12 or so hours. Somewhere between 8 and 12 hours, it's going to look like this. And you're going to see it looks kind of bubbly, kind of lumpy, and I don't know exactly how this will appear in pictures or on video, but it may almost look to you like there are a lot of little black dots. That's what my husband was thinking. And I can see how if you're a new home baker, it might look like that to you as well. But all that is just bubbles. It's just air trapped in the dough. And what you're going to want to look for is a lot of lumps and bumps like this, a lot of little bubbles. And when you shake it, like this, it's going to kind of shake like Jell-O. That's perfect. Now this is the one that has the 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, and you'll see they basically look identical. A lot of little bubbles, a lot of little lumps and bumps. When you shake it, it looks just like Jell-O. And this is exactly what you're going to be looking for, and it's what you're going to see. And again, it's very forgiving. On your counter with the 1/2 teaspoon of yeast, 8 to 12 hours, somewhere in there. With the 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, somewhere in the 16-hour range. You even have a little wiggle room there. If you go past 16 hours, I don't want you to worry. And both of these, this one can do very well in the fridge for 24 hours, and this one can do very well in the fridge for 48 hours. And you have to forgive me if I repeat a lot. It's just I know sometimes some folks will hop around a lot in a video, so I do like to repeat so that maybe you fall on a part that is answering a question that you might have. Now, I think a lot of folks will be making this dough in the morning and baking it for dinner. And you're probably going to be using that half a teaspoon of yeast. So I'll go ahead and bake up this one, and I can show you how that comes. It's going to have a crisp crust, beautiful crumb, and it's going to be very tasty. Now, this isn't required, but if you have one of these little plastic, very inexpensive bench scrapes, this works great for getting your dough out of the bowl and then also just using it to help you get it into a round ball. But if you don't have this, don't worry, you can also do it with your hands. All we're going to do at this point is just sprinkle some flour onto our cutting board, or onto our baking board in essence. This is actually an Italian pasta board for making pasta. But whatever you have, if you've got I've got tiles, so it doesn't work as well, but if you've got a smooth countertop, you can do it right on your countertop. Now I'm just going to angle this. In essence, it's going to start spilling out, but I want you to see as the bubbles become elongated, you can actually see and look at all this wonderful gluten formation up here. How beautiful this dough has achieved a wonderful consistency. So now we'll just empty this out of our bowl onto our floured board. I sprinkled some flour and then I rubbed it around with my hand, and now I'm just going to dump the dough right onto this floured board. Now I've just got my hands floured. I'm just sprinkling from the board a little bit of flour. We don't want to add too much more flour. That's the whole kind of point of this, is that it should be very shaggy and moist. And that's where these bench scrapes come in really handy. We're just going to pull that over, pull this over, pull the other side over, and pull that over, and we're just gonna kind of work it to where we get it into a ball. So once you've just kind of folded all four sides on top of each other, then you're just gonna flip it over, and then all we're gonna do is just kind of circle it around a little, make a little tension on top, and form it into a ball best we can. So you're just going to move this around in a circle just best you can. And don't worry if it sticks a little, you can sprinkle it with a little flour. Another trick you can also do is to just wet your hands. A lot of folks like to do that, and I don't blame them. I like that method too when you're making these breads that don't involve any kneading. At this point, all we're going to do is take this bowl or a dish towel, whatever you want to use. I like to just use the bowl that I took the batter out of, or the dough out of, and cover it like this. We're going to leave it for 30 minutes. Now, while this is resting for 30 minutes, we're going to go ahead and we're going to preheat our oven. Now, if you're using a Dutch oven, you can go ahead and put that into the cold oven so it will preheat as well with the oven. Generally, what you want to use is somewhere between a 4-quart to a 6-quart Dutch oven. And what I have here is a 5.5 quart. If you're just using a baking sheet, you don't have to do anything. All you need to do is just get your baking sheet available, put a piece of parchment paper on it if you've got it, and set it aside and be ready to put your dough on that to bake it. Now I'll teach you a little trick if you're not using a Dutch oven and you are using a baking sheet and you still want to create the steam that is naturally created by having the bread in a Dutch oven with the lid on it. You can do a couple of different things. If you want, you can put your dough on your baking sheet into the oven, give it a little squirt of water, and then quickly close your oven door. But a better thing to do is on the very lowest rack of your oven, put some sort of heat-proof container. It could be a heat-proof frying pan. It could be a heat-proof pie pan, anything like that that you would use to bake something or cook something in your oven. Put some ice in there and then go ahead and put that into the oven along with your dough that's on the baking sheet. But you're just going to put the vessel holding the ice, the oven-proof vessel holding the ice, on the lowest rack of your oven. And that's going to create a lot of steam in your oven. It's not exactly like professional bakers, we're just home bakers, but it will create steam as the ice melts and help create a lovely bread. Now, to start this process, I like to preheat my oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, we're not going to bake the bread at 500 degrees Fahrenheit, but I like to preheat the oven that hot. That way, when we open the door, get the dough into the Dutch oven, open the door again, get the Dutch oven back into the oven, we're lowering the temperature. So I at least like to give it a good starting point, so to speak. Now, what temperature to bake your bread at? I have a very small oven. I have the smallest wall oven that's made. And so I bake my bread on the middle rack, and I recommend that no matter what size oven you have, you bake your bread on the middle rack. And I generally bake my bread somewhere between 425 degrees Fahrenheit and 450 degrees Fahrenheit. If you have a very large wall oven, or you have the type of oven that's underneath your cooktop, an actual stove that's generally very large, you may need to heat your oven or bake your bread at 475 degrees Fahrenheit. There are some variations, and you will get to know your oven the best after you bake this one time. If you bake your bread at 425 degrees Fahrenheit and you find that the bottom just didn't brown up as you had hoped after 30 minutes, next time bake it at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. But don't worry, I'm going to tell you how to fix it if it's not the exact color that you were hoping for. If you find you bake it at 450 and the bottom gets too dark, then next time around, just lower it to 425 degrees. And so it's just a learning process. The same thing with 475. If you find that that was a little too hot for your oven, pull it back to 450. There's just a little bit of experimentation the first time around. But if for any reason it's underbaked a bit, don't worry, because after 30 minutes, we're going to remove the lid and allow the bread to bake for a little bit uncovered. And at that point, you can check your bread. And if the bottom looks as though it's very light, you can just pop the temperature up to from 425, for example, to 450, or from 450 to 475, and allow it to bake for those last few minutes at the higher temperature, and everything will come out perfect. What if at 30 minutes you check it and it's a little too brown on the bottom? Well, what I generally recommend is don't worry about it. Chances are it's not overbaked. Chances are it's not that brown, and chances are it's not burnt. If it is, you can always let it cool, and then you can take a butter knife and just scrape off some of the brown on the bottom, which will just flake right off into your garbage can. But chances are the bottom is going to look okay, regardless of the temperature you bake it at, if you've got it on the middle rack. But if you're exceptionally concerned about it, you can always do little cheats in the beginning when you're first making bread and learning how to make bread. Check it at 20 minutes. Check it at 25 minutes. Just be careful, use your pot holders and all of that. And if it looks like the bottom is browning too much, just lower the temperature of your oven and you'll be fine. There is a little bit of a learning curve. Now, since I have a very small oven, I'm going to bake this particular bread at 425 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. And I'll have all of these details in a blog post that'll correspond with this video. That'll be over on my website, marysnest.com, and I'll be sure to put a link to that recipe in the description below. The most important thing that I want to reassure you about is that bread baking is just a learning process, and this is a very easy recipe. It's very forgiving, and you're going to find after you make this a few times, you're going to get a good feel as to exactly how much water you need, and you're also going to get a good feel as to what temperature works best in your oven. For those new to home baking and specifically making these artisan-style breads, I wanted to share a little history with you about these type of breads. They're very easy to make, as we've seen, because you mix the flour and the water, the salt and the yeast, and then you just let it sit for a while, depending on how much yeast you use and how long you want it to sit. And then you basically dump it out onto a floured surface, and 1, 2, 3, just kind of fold it over itself to make it easy to flip it, and then just use your hands to cup it into a bowl and then cover it, and that's it. There's no kneading, no nothing. This is basically one of the easiest artisan breads you'll ever make, and it's pretty foolproof. So how did this technique come about? It was popularized about 20 years ago, maybe a little less than 20 years ago. However, it's been around a lot longer than that. I want to read something to you that I wrote in my cookbook, the Modern Pioneer Cookbook, and if you've got the cookbook, what I'm going to read is on page 113. And this is just a little side note, but I wanted to let you know, give you a little preview, I'm working on my second cookbook, and I'm just about to finish it. And in October, my editor will be here along with the photographer and the food stylist right here in my kitchen. And they'll be here for about 2 weeks taking pictures for the second cookbook. And I'll be sure to take you along with some pictures from behind the scenes. So stay tuned for that. And my cookbook will be out next year, 2025. So on page 113 of my cookbook, I write, "No knead bread through the centuries." You may recall that back in 2006, no knead bread made a splash on the baking scene thanks to a newspaper article highlighting an easy technique for making artisan quality bread. Although not a true sourdough, that's what I love about it. It makes it nice and easy for folks who may have struggled with sourdough. Although not a true sourdough, this modern no-knead bread used only a 1/4 teaspoon of packaged yeast and a long, slow rise. All of a sudden, this bread was heralded as and forgive the pun, and I actually write it here. All of a sudden, this bread was heralded as, and forgive the pun, the best thing since sliced bread. And you may recall it was Jim Leahy from the Sullivan Street Bakery, and he even wrote a cookbook all about this technique called My Bread. Very cute, My Bread. But did you know that no-knead bread is actually nothing new? Even in the 1940s, Pillsbury Mills was touting a 25-cent pamphlet titled "Bake the No-Knead Way," Ann Pillsbury's Amazing Discovery. Now keep in mind, Ann Pillsbury was a fictional character, just like Betty Crocker, but both were beloved by home cooks who were ready to embrace what Ann was teaching. So how did Ann make this amazing discovery? I'm not exactly sure, but I will share that back in the 1700s, 1739 to be exact, when Eliza Smith was sharing her recipe in a cookbook titled The Complete Housewife. And complete is C-O-M-P-L-E-A-T, The Complete Housewife. It's the old-fashioned spelling, in case you're looking to find a vintage copy of this online. In her recipe for what she called French bread, when describing how to handle the dough, Eliza tells us a peck of fine flour, a little salt, a pint of ale yeast, which I'll explain in a minute, a pint of ale yeast, stir it about with your hand, but be sure you don't knead them. Apparently, Eliza had made her own amazing discovery. But Eliza didn't have modern-day commercially packaged yeast like Jim Leahy did and like Ann Pillsbury did, or at least the Pillsbury Company did. So what did she do? Well, maybe her recipe discovery went back to the Middle Ages, and possibly well before, when French bakers were making sourdough bread. And in parentheses, I write, Eliza's quote-unquote French bread recipe, her French bread perhaps, that was perhaps her French bread that she was referring, maybe not the French bread necessarily that we think of when we think of maybe a baguette, but she was calling something French bread because maybe she had gotten the recipe from these earlier French bakers who were making sourdough and making a loose dough and letting it work its magic over time and not kneading it. So I go back, sorry, I got a little distracted there. Well, maybe her recipe discovery went back to the Middle Ages and possibly well before, when French bakers were making sourdough bread. Eliza's French bread, perhaps? That most likely was never needed, because they were just letting the sourdough, the yeast, the wild yeast from the sourdough do the work. They had to make a lot of bread. They didn't have time all day long to be kneading away. So instead of kneading the dough, the sourdough starter did all the work during a slow rise, in the same way Eliza's pint of ale yeast, you might remember that I mentioned from her earlier recipe, and this is otherwise known as the wild yeast barm. It's sort of the foam that would occur on top of the beer making process. And so Eliza's pint of ale yeast, otherwise known as the wild yeast barm, rose her bread with a slow rise and no kneading. So like Eliza and the French bakers before her, we too are going to be traditional bakers. You know, I always talk about having a traditional foods kitchen. We are going to be traditional bakers by embracing, in this case, I'm specifically talking about a sourdough starter, and the no-knead way of baking. But what's so beautiful about all of this is whether you have a sourdough starter, whether you have a little commercial yeast, whether you've got some barm, maybe you're making homemade beer and you've got some of that ale, the yeast from the ale, and you're using that. There's all different types of things that you can use to rise your bread without kneading it. You just need a little bit of whatever you're using, whether it's packaged yeast, sourdough starter, or barm, and you let that do the work. And that's what makes these breads so easy and basically foolproof. Now it's been about 30 minutes and my oven has come up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Now all I'm going to do is take some flour and just sprinkle it on top of this mound of dough, and I'm just going to score it once. If you want, you can just dump it into your Dutch oven or put it onto your baking sheet as is and let it crack wherever it would like. But I'm going to score it just so I can show you what to do if you're completely new to this. Now, if you're an experienced baker, you might have something known as a lame. If you're new to home baking, a lame is, or known as a French lame, is a tool that has a very sharp razor blade on a handle. And you use the razor blade to make different scoring patterns on your dough before baking it. And you might see some people are very good at it and they make beautiful decorations. But don't worry, you don't need a lame. As I said, you can just put this in as is, or if you do want to score it, you can just take a little paring knife and with the tip, just make any type of score you want. You can do 3 straight lines across, you can do a little bit of a curved line, so to speak. That's the type that when you make a little curve like that, sometimes it'll split in a way that'll create what people will call a little ear that's nice and crusty on top. Hopefully that works. I've baked these for many years now. And sometimes my scoring comes great. Sometimes it just looks like it naturally split, even though I had scored it. So whatever you want to do, again, this is all very forgiving. Decide whatever way you want to do it, and it's going to be great. Now, if you're doing this on a baking sheet, all you're going to want to do is use your bench scrape, or if you have a spatula, those pancake spatulas that are kind of round work really well, you're just going to put this right onto your baking sheet. I like to put a piece of parchment paper down, but it's definitely not required. And speaking of parchment paper, if you're a little nervous, if you're new to this and you're a little nervous about transferring this and plopping it down into a really hot Dutch oven, you can again use your bench scrape or a spatula to pick this up, put it onto your parchment paper, and then lower your parchment paper down into your Dutch oven. If you do use parchment paper, just make sure it's completely tucked into your Dutch oven before you put the lid on. Now I took my Dutch oven out of my oven, I lowered the temperature to 425, and now I'm going to take this lid off. There may be a little steam, so I'm going to open it away from me. Alrighty, now what I'm going to do is just put this lid on a pot holder over there, and this is piping hot. You can really feel it. So I picked up the dough. I actually used my pancake spatula. These work great for that process. And I dumped it down into my Dutch oven. Now we're all ready to put the lid back on. And once we put that lid back on, we're going to go ahead and pop that into the oven. Well, my timer just went off at 30 minutes, so I took this out of my oven, and now we'll have the reveal for how it looks after 30 minutes. And again, if you're doing this with a Dutch oven, always open away from you because there's always the possibility that steam will come out. Ooh, and it did. Oh, that looks fantastic. Now what we're going to do is put it back into the oven and let it brown up without the lid on, and we're going to let it brown up a little more on top. It's still at 425 Fahrenheit, and I'm going to keep an eye on it. Again, you know, it's not an exact science. You just kind of got to watch it. Sometimes it reaches the color I like within 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes 15 minutes. So I'm just going to keep an eye on it, and then I'll show you how it looks once it browns up on the top. There's just one other thing I wanted to mention to you that you might have a question about when you're baking in a Dutch oven or on a baking sheet, that when you put it down onto the baking sheet that has not been lined with a piece of parchment paper, you can sprinkle a bit of flour. The same is true in a Dutch oven. If you're not using parchment paper, you can sprinkle a little flour, sometimes cornmeal, sometimes people will use wheat bran, different things, to give the bread a little cushion, in essence, on the bottom. I had a lot of flour on my board when I was shaping the boule, so I had a lot of flour already on the bottom, so I didn't feel it was necessary to add more. But you can really just sort of experiment with that. It helps with preventing it from scorching and sticking. So you always want to make sure that if you're not using parchment paper, you've got some flour underneath your boule, or you throw in a little cornmeal or a little wheat bran. Look at this glorious bread. Now, in my oven, this was in there for about 15 minutes at 425 degrees Fahrenheit to brown up like this on top, and I think it's perfect. Now, I want to mention one thing. If you used parchment paper to drop your bread originally into a Dutch oven, when you remove the lid and get ready to put it back into your oven to brown on top, you want to shimmy out, so to speak, the parchment paper, and just use, a pot holder. Be very careful. Everything's hot, including the parchment paper. And shimmy that parchment paper out and just put that aside. The reason is, if you leave the parchment paper in the Dutch oven, when you go to put it back into the oven to brown up the top, it tends to keep the sides from browning. So you just want to make sure that you shimmy that out. Now, if you're doing this on a baking sheet, you don't have to worry about these steps. You're going to be baking your bread on your baking sheet in your oven, and at 30 minutes it's probably going to look really good, and you don't need to bake it that little bit of extra time to brown on top because it's been exposed to the heat for the total time, the total baking time. And if at 30 minutes it doesn't look where you want it to be, let it go another 5 or 10 minutes, whatever the case may be, until it does have that wonderful golden brown color. Now this should move around very easily, so you can see if you can hear that. This should move around very easily in your Dutch oven, and it's just a matter of using a spatula or something to kind of wedge it out, and then we're going to go ahead and put it on its cooling rack. Now all I've done is taken my spatula and wedged it underneath, and now I'm going to transfer it right over to the cooling rack. Now that I've lifted it out of the Dutch oven, you can see the flour that remained behind in the Dutch oven. And so that was basically my base that was underneath my dough when I put it in. So if you feel that you don't have enough flour maybe under your dough, maybe it's sticking a little when you go to pick it up and drop it in, you can always make sure that you put a little flour, as I said, cornmeal or wheat bran. Those are kind of the common things that people will put down at the bottom of a Dutch oven, or for that matter, on the baking sheet when they're baking bread. You may have even noticed that when you've purchased bread, either from the bakery section at your grocery store or a regular bakery, sometimes it looks like there's a little cornmeal on the bottom. Now I just want to tap this so you can hear how wonderful this crust is. Can you hear that? I'm leaning in with the mic. It's beautiful. Now this, as you can see, some people call this the ear. This is where I had scored it. But as I mentioned, sometimes these breads have a mind of their own and it might split in other places, but that doesn't affect the taste. Nothing to worry about. And if you didn't want to make a mark on top of your boule, you can go ahead and just dump it right in and it'll crack wherever it feels like cracking. Now this is warm. It's very difficult to resist warm bread, but I'm just going to give this a little more time to cool. What happens if you cut into bread when it's really hot, it can get a little appearance of being somewhat gummy in its, as they call the crumb, the interior texture. So it's best to let it cool a little. If you can let it cool completely and you have wonderful willpower, that's great. But if not, at least let it cool to where you can comfortably hold it. And something I want to mention to you, especially if you're new to baking, experienced bakers will know this, but you can tap the bottom. I don't know if you can hear that on the mic. And it sounds kind of hollow. That tells you your bread is done. Well, this has cooled, so we'll start to slice this and we'll put some butter on it and do a taste test. Gee, where should we cut into this? Everything looks so good. How about right here? I always love the end. That's my favorite piece. Listen to that. A serrated knife is great for this, by the way. Oh, it looks wonderful. I'll take a close-up picture so that you can see, and we'll definitely make a few more slices. Look at these glorious slices. Oh, and the aroma, it's so wonderful. Look at this beautiful bread. You're gonna love this because it's nice and crusty on the outside, yet it's definitely tender inside. You could make some wonderful sandwiches with this toasted. Anyway, I mean, it's just a magnificent bread and so easy to make. And I want to mention, we already talked about making this with different types of ancient grains in their all-purpose form. You can also use this recipe. It's very versatile. You can do half all-purpose flour, half all-grain flour. You can throw in nuts. You can throw in dried fruits. You can use different sweeteners if you want to add a bit of sweetness to the bread. There's just so much versatility in this recipe, and I will definitely share more. If you like this, look at this butter. It's so yellow. Got to put a little butter on it. If you like this video, let me know in the comments below, and I'll definitely make more breads using this same technique, but maybe some that are sweeter, maybe like a cranberry walnut bread as we go into the holidays. Alrighty, now the taste test. This is so good. You are going to really enjoy this bread. Now, if you would like more bread recipes, whether they're quick, well, this isn't a quick bread per se, but a yeasted bread and actual quick breads, rolls, sourdough, whatever you're looking for, be sure to click on this playlist over here because I have all types of bread and more. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.